Here is a statistic that should send a chill down the spine of any financial analyst or geopolitical strategist. 99.9%. For decades up until 2024, Canada sold exactly 99.9% of its natural gas to a single customer. The United States of America. Not 90%, not 95%, but the entire lifeblood of a mining and energy powerhouse flowed in only one direction, south, pouring directly into Washington's hands. Canada had no LNG export terminals opening to the ocean. Not a single liquefied natural gas carrier crossed the Pacific to Asia. There were no long-term contracts signed with Europe. In a monopoly buyer position, the U.S. held all the cards. Washington understood that they were not just buying cheap energy. They held absolute leverage over the entire economy of their northern neighbor until a geopolitical gamble erupted. When Donald Trump returned to the White House and launched a tariff war of unprecedented scale, imposing 25% tariffs on goods, 10% directly targeting Canadian energy, and threatening escalation to 35% or even 50% via fiery social media posts. Washington assumed Ottawa would panic, back down, and concede. However, they made a fatal miscalculation in game theory. While global media was consumed by the bluster and tariff letters, behind closed boardroom doors from Dusseldorf and Paris to Seoul and Beijing, Canada was quietly activating a geopolitical escape route worth tens of billions of dollars. It was a dramatic exit that not only broke Ottawa free from America's economic grip, but also permanently redrew the global energy security map. What really happened? How did a nation 99.9% dependent on a single market pull off the most spectacular pivot in North American history? Let's break down every move on the board. To grasp the magnitude of this shock, we must first look squarely at the raw truth of North American interdependence. For decades, the North American energy relationship operated on a default assumption. Canada was America's bottomless reservoir of cheap resources. With pipeline infrastructure designed exclusively to flow across the U.S. border, Canada was virtually stripped of pricing power. They were forced to sell crude and natural gas at deep discounts, enduring forced price cuts, simply because they had no alternative buyer. When the trade war broke out in early 2025, the Trump administration deployed its familiar playbook: tariffs as an economic weapon. Slapping 25% duties on broad imports and targeting energy was intended to force Canada into concessions. Yet, Washington calculated based on historical complacency while overlooking a shifting reality. America itself breathes through Canada's energy lungs. Canada supplies nearly 100% of all natural gas imported by the United States. Canada accounts for 63.4% of total U.S. crude oil imports as of 2025. Canada provides 81% of the electricity imported across the U.S. power grid. When Washington squeezed the tariff vice, it was essentially tightening a grip around its own supply throat. More importantly, using economic coercion against a close ally triggered an inevitable counter-reaction. It shattered Ottawa's lingering illusions of permanent friendship, transforming market diversification from a standard economic policy into a matter of survival and national sovereignty. On June 30, 2025, amidst escalating 35% tariff threats online, a historic turning point unfolded in total silence. An LNG carrier named the Gaslog Glasgow quietly departed Kitimat, British Columbia. Its destination, South Korea. This marked the first commercial LNG cargo in Canadian history transported independently across the Pacific, bypassing every single U.S. pipeline and requiring zero approval or licensing from Washington. Behind that single voyage lay the LNG Canada megaproject, a $40 billion endeavor representing the largest private sector investment in the nation's history, boasting an initial phase capacity of 14 million tons per year. Canada's geographic advantage delivered an immediate blow to competitors. The maritime route from Canada's west coast to East Asian industrial hubs, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, China takes just 10 days, cutting the 20-day journey from the U.S. Gulf Coast in half. Canada was no longer landlocked in energy. Overnight, it stepped onto the global stage as a major liquefied natural gas exporter. If the vessel to South Korea unlocked the Pacific, July 29, 2026, permanently reconfigured the transatlantic energy architecture. In Düsseldorf, Germany, energy titan Uniper signed a 20-year binding contract worth $30 billion to purchase 2 million tons of Canadian LNG annually, with delivery starting in 2032. To understand why Berlin was so eager to sign, we must look back to February 24, 2022. When the Russia-Ukraine conflict erupted and the Nord Stream pipelines were severed, Germany's industrial foundation nearly collapsed. Germany had previously relied on Russia for over 40% of its natural gas supply. Uniper, Germany's largest gas importer, suffered catastrophic losses of 100 million euros per day, culminating in the largest corporate loss in German history. 40 billion euros wiped out. Berlin had to step in with over 50 billion euros of taxpayer money to nationalize and rescue the company. That bitter experience taught Germany an indelible lesson: never entrust national security to a partner capable of weaponizing energy supplies. Post-2022, Europe was not searching for a discount vendor. It was desperately seeking an ironclad, trustworthy partner. Canada stepped forward with two distinct assets no competitor could match simultaneously: massive scale and gold standard political stability. Furthermore, British Columbia's Xi's Lisim's LNG project is powered entirely by clean hydroelectricity, making it one of the lowest carbon intensity LNG production facilities on Earth. For a Europe bound by strict emission standards and ESG criteria, Canadian gas represented the ideal strategic match. The Uniper deal was not an isolated transaction. In May 2026, Securing Energy for Europe, formerly Gazprom's nationalized German subsidiary, locked in 1 million tons per year for 20 years. Soon after, Shell and French energy major Total Energies followed, with Total Energies securing 2 million tons per year and acquiring a 5% stake in the project. Buyers from the UK, Sweden, and the Netherlands began queuing up in Ottawa. While Washington remained fixated on social media rhetoric, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, and a seasoned financial strategist, executed a comprehensive pivot. Upon taking office, Carney made it clear: the era of unconditional dependence on the U.S. market was over. The U.S. had raised tariff barriers to heights unseen since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Ottawa's counter-strategy followed an ambitious roadmap, establishing the Federal Major Projects Office to fast-track approvals for strategic pipeline and port infrastructure under national priority status, deploying multipolar diplomacy with visits to Beijing, Brussels, Berlin, London, and Tokyo, brokering deals such as lowering EV tariffs with China in exchange for agricultural market access, alongside signing critical energy security pacts with the EU, setting a $300 billion target to double non-U.S. exports over the next decade, projecting non-U.S. natural gas export shares to surge from near 0% to 55% by the early 2030s. These were not mere talking points. Oil pipeline capacity from Alberta to the Pacific coast, notably through the expanded Trans Mountain (TMX) system, was already redirecting over 70% of new volume straight to Asian markets. Once the Pacific door was thrown open, international capital flowed in naturally. Why are Canada's moves strategically irreversible on the North American chessboard? First, the binding nature of 20-year contracts. A presidential administration's tariff policy can shift with a pen stroke, a social media post, or a midterm election. Multi-decade, tens of billion-dollar LNG purchase agreements between state-backed conglomerates cannot. Once Uniper, Cefi, Total Energies, and Shell committed their balance sheets and integrated their supply chains for 2 decades, that capacity became permanently locked down. Washington cannot intervene, punish, or force Canada to breach sovereign international commitments. Second, dismantling the single buyer trap. In political economy, whichever nation controls market access commands sovereignty. Previously, Canada extracted the resource while America controlled the valves. Today, with Canadian export terminals facing both the Atlantic and Pacific, forced discounting evaporates. Canada can sell at international market prices. historically higher than domestic North American benchmarks, channeling hundreds of billions of dollars directly into its economy. Third, the realignment of Western economic partnerships. By using tariffs as coercive tools against its closest neighbor, the U.S. inadvertently pushed other allies, Germany, France, South Korea, Japan, to build autonomous networks of mutual resilience. Canada has emerged as the essential energy linchpin connecting Europe and Asia, transitioning from an economic satellite of Washington into an independent global energy hub. On August 22, 2026, when Washington escalated further by announcing 50% tariffs on $20 billion worth of Canadian goods, Prime Minister Mark Carney responded by suspending trade negotiations and announcing dollar-for-dollar retaliatory measures. Yet the world recognizes that Canada's definitive counter-move was not the short-term retaliation announced in August, but the binding contracts sealed in Dusseldorf in July 2026. It created a strategic multi-billion-dollar exit corridor, established an international customer base, and ended nearly a century of single-buyer dominance. Economic history proves a fundamental truth. The most decisive geopolitical shifts rarely occur through bluster during a crisis. They are built quietly through infrastructure blueprints, ocean-bound pipelines, and decisive signatures behind closed boardroom doors. As the Canadian Prime Minister stated, "Mastering our energy is mastering our destiny." Whether Washington realizes it has pushed its most critical energy supplier out of reach, or whether this global realignment has already passed the point of no return, the board has fundamentally changed.